As I was studying for class this morning, I had to think of what Peter said about Paul and some of his writings, that some of them are hard to understand. This is not the easiest section to understand that we're going into, but we're going to muddle through. We've got to finish up the 10th chapter first and then go on into chapter 11. Chapter 10 is repeating again some of the things that Paul had already said concerning meats offered to idols. He's addressed that back in chapter 8. He comes back to it uh, with this saying this time, with this comment. He says, "Flee things that are offered to idols. Flee this whole situation." And then it goes on to talk about the reality that when someone is sacrificing and participating in idol worship, they're participating in demon worship because that's the source. That's who's behind idol worship. It's Satan himself and demons. And so he's making that clear. Then down in verse 23, this is where we had gotten to in our discussion last week. He wants to establish the fact that uh, after all he said about the idol and about the meats offered to idols and the ritualistic ceremony involved in the worship of the idol, he wants to make clear that they are nothing. He's not recognizing the idols as being anything special. They have no power, nor should the worship of the idol be anything other than recognizing it as being a service to demon. So he says here, all things are legitimate, and I'm reading from the Amplified uh, Bible. All things are legitimate, permissible, and we are free to do anything we please, but not all things are helpful, expedient, profitable, and wholesome. All things are legitimate, but not all things are constructive to character and edifying to spiritual life. That's a lengthy way of reading verse 23, but I think it includes everything that needs to be included there. uh, God has created this world for us, and there's legitimate uses for what He has created. But we can abuse those things, can't we? And if we legitimately use what God has created for us, then we're okay. Uh, but even with the freedom that we have, because of this issue of the eating of meats, it's not always the best. It's not for edifying and building up someone else. And so here he's wanting us to be sure that we understand that we have an obligation to our brothers and sisters to be very careful on what we allow ourselves to do. Verse 24, going back to the King James, he says, "Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth." When you first read that, it sounds like you're going after someone else's wealth, but that's not what he's saying. He's saying that we're not to be concerned about ourselves, but others before ourselves. We are to seek other people's good even above our own good. That's what he's trying to establish there. Then he gets very specific and very practical. He says, "Whatever is sold in the shambles, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake." Basically, what he's saying, whatever sold in the open market, um, and they would have a meat market. I don't know whether you've probably seen them on TV and this sort of thing, where in some countries they have an open meat market where they have chickens hanging by their feet and meat, displayed out there. And that would have been a type. They didn't have refrigeration, but they would have meat that had been killed. And he says, when you go to buy that, don't ask questions for conscience sake. In other words, don't go up and say, "Now, was this offered to an idol? Where'd this come from?" And this sort of thing.
Just want to know if they kept flies off.
Yeah. Would you spread those out so I can see what I'm buying? Oh me, I've thought about that, Jimmy. It's not very appetizing for us, is it? We're used to the vacuum packed sealed stuff that's kept in refrigeration and that sort of thing. He says, "For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." That's a quote from Psalms 24:1. It's quoted again in Psalms 50, and it's also quoted in Deuteronomy 10, verse 14. The earth is the Lord and everything's in it. And basically, what he's saying, God has created this world, he's created it with legitimate uses. Meat has been given to us as a means to sustain life. There is a legitimate use for eating meat. So don't that should not be a concern. He says, "If any of them that believe not bid you to the feast, and ye be disposed to go, whatsoever is set before you eat, asking no question for conscience sake." And so it's permissible for Christians to enjoy the fellowship and meals with people that are not Christians. In fact, it's expected for us to be able to do that. That's how we get to know one another and can possibly have an influence on someone else. But he's saying when you go to this person's house, before you sit down and eat, don't start questioning him. Now, where did this come from? Where did you get that meat? Was it offered out? And this sort of thing. He says, if it's not mentioned, go ahead and eat and don't make an issue of it. Then he goes on, "But if any man say unto you, this is offered in sacrifice unto idols, eat not for his sake that showed it, for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." Some of the more recent translations do not carry this repeat of that phrase. They felt like it was added later on, and that may very well be. There does not seem to be a real purpose to repeat it here because it's already been stated, and certainly it's still applicable in either case. But here you go to a situation and you go to this person's home, and before you begin eating, he makes it clear, now this meat was offered to idols, and uh, there's the sense that this person may have even participated in that worship. He says, now whatever you do not eat it for conscience sake, but not your conscience, his conscience. You do not want to allow him to think you as a Christian will participate in that type of service.
You know, was the man of the house that's providing the meal saying that this was
That
offered?
it seems to be the two situations. One's a person who's not a Christian who asks you to eat. He doesn't say anything about where the food came from. But then the second situation, you go into a home, and this person may or may not be a Christian. If it goes along with the first, he may not be. But it makes a point of saying, now the meat you're about to eat was offered to an idol.
Was he going to
Well, that probably was true.
offend him if you eat then? That's puzzling.
Well, if you go ahead, then you're sanctioning what he's doing. You're saying what you're doing is okay, and I'm going to participate with you. So you're saying Christians can, yeah. So you don't want to do that, and if you're going to have influence on him to become a Christian, if you go ahead and do this, you're not going to have any influence at all on him.
Yeah, looking at the situation before that you just mentioned,
Right.
when you come to this one, you would think, well, if he's understanding that it's offered to idols, then it's not going to offend him if you eat it. You know, that's
I've wondered, and I may be wrong here, if in this setting this may be another person who's at the feast that you've been invited to, of the person who's not the Christian, and this may be a fellow Christian who's there with you, and then he makes this comment, "Do you know this meat was offered to idols?" And in that case, he says, "Don't eat it," because this person is expressing a concern and maybe a weakness there as far as his own faith is concerned. That could be involved as well. I'm not for sure. It's not just real clear. Yes, sir, Chris. Right.
Their contention with each other, right? So he's saying once you know, don't.
Right.
If you don't know, you didn't know.
Right.
So therefore, it cannot be a contention because it was not stated, it was not made
Right.
an issue. It seems to be that this person in this second case is making it an issue. Therefore, you
Right.
refuse.
Right. Once it becomes a point of knowledge and knowing this person is aware of that and concerned, then definitely you're not to participate. He goes on to clarify, verse 29, conscience, I say, not thine own, but of the other. For why is my liberty judged of another man's conscience? uh, it's all it's like he makes this statement and then he asks two rhetorical questions. You're doing this, you're abstaining from eating for conscience sake, but not yours. You know there's nothing in the idol. You know there's nothing in the eating of the meat at all, but you're going to not do it for his conscience sake. And then he asks the question, uh, why should my liberty be controlled by someone else's conscience? Now, in that point, he's stating it as he stands before God. In other words, this is not a matter of something that is right and wrong within itself. And were the circumstances different? In fact, the first case was he could eat the meat and no problem was there at all. And then he says, whether for if by grace, and actually that word that's translated grace in King James is probably better translated thanksgiving. For if by thanksgiving I be a partaker, why would I be evil spoken of? In other words, there should not be a matter of criticism if I'm doing something that is, I have the liberty to do, it's not wrong within itself. I'm not judged by someone else's conscience within myself. Now, under the circumstances, if he were alone or if he were in the first instance with someone and eating the meat, nothing was a problem. But it becomes a problem if the second situation is there.
I think clearly now why you said it's hard to understand.
Yes, I know. Okay, he says, whether therefore ye eat or drink or whatever ye do, do all to the glory of God. So our life that we live our life according to what our conscience has been taught, and we do it in faith, giving thanks to God. We don't violate our conscience. Uh, but not violating our conscience does not give us the freedom then to willingly and knowingly violate someone else's conscience in a way that would influence them to do wrong, to sin against their own conscience. He goes on, give none offense neither to the Jew nor the Gentiles nor to the church of God. That word Gentiles could have been translated Greeks, and in some translations it is. And so basically he's saying to all men outside the church, Jews, Gentiles, or Greeks outside the church, and those within the brotherhood. The whole issue earlier in 8 and over in Romans chapter 14, it had to do with brethren, the weak and the strong brother. And he was talking about those within the church that had a problem with this. And so he's saying, whatever the situation, live in such a way that you're not going to offend or cause someone else to sin. He said, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking mine own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. That's the whole crux of his whole discussion, of the way he is living his life and wanting to be able to relate to and cause others to be saved. Actually, verse 1 of chapter 11 should have been left in the last chapter because basically it summarizes again, and it's right here. He says, be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. Christ set the example, did he not? For putting others' good above his own, of suffering for others, doing what was required of him. Uh, did he want to? In one sense, he did, but in another sense, when he prayed in the garden, he said, let this cup pass from me. You know, was not looking forward to the suffering that he knew that he was going to have to go. His human side knew exactly what he was about to go through. And if there was any other way, he said, if there's any other way, let it be done. But not my will, but thine be done. And so that pretty much wraps up and concludes this whole discussion that he had in chapter 10. And why they made the division where they did, I'm not for sure, because there's a definite change now. We're going to change, our focus and what we're going to be talking about. And to tell you the truth, it's not any easier than the other, Jimmy. It just gets more difficult. Okay, let's muddle through this. He says, "Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the ordinances or traditions." That's another translation for the word ordinance, "as I delivered them to you." And so he's commending them. Paul is very good about that. And he's honoring them because they came to him with their questions. We've gone through this whole series of chapters now for quite a while that he's answering questions that they wrote to him about. And so he's expressing his appreciation to them for being willing to come to him and wanting to know what he wanted them to do. They wanted to follow exactly whatever he was teaching them to do. And so that's commendable. Now he says, I want you to know something. I want you to understand this. And I would imagine this again was a matter of a question that had come up, that they're questioning him. It's an issue that has developed within that congregation, and that is the role of women and men as they are in worship. And it has to do with a custom that was prevalent in the Corinthian church. But it also may have had to do with the authority issue, because he's certainly going to establish that. You think some of the women may have been resisting the authority of their husband?
Could be.
Could be. That certainly would not be, something that we would not think about. This has probably been around ever since the first family was instituted. I don't know. You remember when Sarah and Abraham uh, were waiting for the promise of the child, and Sarah took it upon herself to come up with an idea of how they were going to actually accomplish what God had promised.
Even he didn't go ask her husband, should I eat of that tree?
No, she didn't. She went out on her own. And had she asked him first, it might have been different. But anyway, getting back to Sarah and Abraham, you remember when she came up with the idea she was going to allow him to marry or have a relationship with her maidservant, make her a concubine. It was a status of them being able to have sexual relations. It was recognized by that culture and this sort of thing. And then whatever child was born would actually go to the credit of the person who owned that servant. And so it would actually technically be a son of Sarah, not not Hagar. All I could think of was Rahab. But anyway, you remember when it didn't work out? What did Sarah say? This is your fault, Abraham. You did this. And now she hates me and she's being insolent and all this sort of thing. So, isn't that the way it is? It was. I mean, he was in the one in the authority who made the final decision. He went along with Sarah, as men often do,
Amen.
and sometimes to their regret. But anyway, I do believe that this was probably an issue that they had questioned. So he's going to establish the order of authority. He says, "But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God." You know, I've been reading another book that Chris has passed on to me, talking about God and the relationship. of the three personalities within the Godhead, uh, all of them being one divine source of power, being united in a way that makes them one. They're equal. They all share the same divine essence and personalities and this sort of thing. And yet, within that setting, we have this indication that God the Father is the preeminent one. And that Jesus, you remember when he was on earth, what he said several times, especially in the book of John, I came not to do my will, but the will of my Father. What I say is, they're not my words, they're my Father's words. I Everything that I'm doing to the glory of God the Father. This is there's another indication also in 1 Corinthians 15 talking about the final judgment at the time that this world comes to an end, and uh, at that point it says that Christ will give back over to God the authority that he's been given. And so there is this indication that within the Godhead and the personality there, that God the Father is a supreme being. And this is basically pointed out here. The head of Christ is God. Christ lived to do the will of his Father. Pardon?
He lost his sound.
I can't hear a thing you're saying. Oh,
It just couldn't
oh, did it?
understand.
Is it back on? Well, I don't know what happened. The little green light's not blinking, so all right, I'll just hold it. Maybe I can lay it right there because I'm going to need both my hands in just a minute. Okay. He goes on here, he says, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels. Don't ask what that means. Deborah, you'll have to shout because I can. Okay. I'm going to read you a lengthy reading in just a minute. I wanted to read through this before I did that. Again, Chris shared several books, and one of them is a commentary on 1 Corinthians by Howard Winters. And he points out that if you go to the commentators, you're going to get confused because everybody has a different opinion as far as what this means. And I have found that to be true. This man agrees with what I think, so this is the one I'm going to use. Uh, he makes sense to me. So if you'll listen very carefully, let me do some reading for you. He says, I believe the basic lesson to be learned is that of a woman's subjection, recognizing her role under man to the man. In Corinth, that subjection was symbolized by long hair and a veil. Now, again, we're talking about a husband and wife. We're talking about a marriage situation here. We need to be sure that we understand that. The woman's head is her husband. And so we're talking about it. He says Paul clearly has in view two coverings, one artificial, the veil, and the other natural hair. Both were of grave significance in that city at that time. The prostitutes had thrown off their outer covering and cut their hair, and in some cases shaved their heads, until both had become the symbol of sexual looseness, prostitution, or independence from any man. That is, the unveiled and short haired woman was saying that she was free, tied to no man, and thus available for immoral purposes. As Georgia Hoff puts it, the unveiled woman was the careless woman, the immoral woman. The veiled woman was the careful wife or mother who was concerned about her reputation. It must be remembered that Corinth was a city of prostitution. It was even practiced as a part of the worship in the temple of idols, and hundreds of beautiful young women paraded in spacious corridors day and night peddling their wares, their trademark being unveiled faces and short hair or shaved heads. A custom had therefore grown up from this practice that forced decent women, those who recognized their role as being under the man, to wear veils, face coverings, and long hair. Paul is here not binding the custom, but regulating it when and where it is enforced, as he does the holy kiss. And this he has a special note about the holy kiss on Romans 16:16. Won't go there, but he's going to explain what that means as well. He's not binding that we kiss each other. He's saying that if you do make it a holy kiss, but it's a matter of greeting one another in a holy, right way. He says the principle of subjection is bound. The principle of subjection is bound, but not the custom. The custom was already being practiced, and he simply regulates it. Customs can and do change, but principles do not. And to regulate a custom bearing upon a principle neither binds the custom nor changes the principle. In this section, the principle is subjugation or subordination, the custom by which one showed that she recognized the principle was long hair and the veil. For the Christian woman to cut her hair and throw off her veil in Corinth would have been an advertisement of immorality. But even further, it would have, in addition to causing her to appear as a prostitute, identified, at least in the minds of some, the worship of God with paganism. From the appearance of unveiled women in the public worship, the uninformed could have concluded that immoral sexual conduct was as much a part of Christianity as it was idolatry. So you see the seriousness of this situation. And I believe that's exactly what this whole section is referring to. And I know the question is, do women need to wear head coverings today? Uh, no, because that has nothing to do with women showing proper respect for their husbands or being modest or moral in our culture today. And so he's not binding that custom, but what he is saying, as a Christian, you have got to be conscious of any custom that has moral connotations in that culture. Wendell.
Bob, I may be all wrong with this, but I've read it somewhere that whenever a woman was caught in an adulterous situation, then they shaved her head.
I think they did that in some cultures. I don't read that in the Bible. In fact, she was stoned if she were caught. I don't think they did anything as far as her uh, hair or clothing. They just, I mean, according to the law of Moses, she was to be taken and stoned. That's what the Pharisees brought the woman to Jesus for. What are you going to do? Are you going to observe the law? And of course, he was judging their hearts. He knew their heart. They didn't bring the man, they just brought the woman. That ought to tell you a little bit about the situation anyway. You got a question or comment?
A bit of both.
Say it real loud, Mr. Nate.
If this was really just a custom, then why do you think that Paul uses such strong language as
Okay, I'm still not hearing you.
right? So if this was just a custom, then why is such strong language used?
Why now?
Why is such strong language used in reference to that natural law that we've discussed in here as well, specifically in um, verses 13 through 15, talking about, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him, but if a woman has long hair, it's for her glory.
Okay.
If it was just
What in
custom,
nature teaches you that a man ought to have short hair?
I'm not familiar with that, and that's why I'm asking you.
Okay.
Is this
What this man says, and I agree, in the context, when he says by nature that is being taught, he's talking about what is the known custom and general rule of the day that is teaching you concerning the man.
do you not think that clashes with the
And
other?
what?
Does that not clash with the other issues of the natural law that we've discussed, such as what was it? I think we discussed a few weeks back about how even people who may not have necessarily been
There's within us there's within us given as a part of God a sense of moral right and wrong. But
you
long
think
hair
this
and
is
short hair is not a part of that moral sensitivity.
but it's the same language, right?
I'm not for sure. We'll have to ask an expert in the language.
It would have to just be custom because the Nazarenes had long hair and it was okay. Correct?
What now?
The Nazarenes, did they not have
Right.
long hair?
They never cut their hair.
Right.
Right.
And there are still cultures today that long hair is very much expected, not tolerated, but expected, like the Native Americans. Their warriors would wear long hair because it was a
Right.
symbol. It was kind of like with Samson. It was a sign of strength.
Right.
So
Well,
different cultures have different
and when you're talking about long and short hair, uh, what is the standard?
cultures.
Because in a lot of cultures, when they make the difference, men have hair down to their shoulders, but the women have it all the way down their back, and they're fine. So what's the standard? So I don't think this has to do with a moral situation that says uh, that men with long hair, uh, are morally wrong. Okay, you do that, and we're gonna continue here. Um,
Before you go on, verse 16 says, read it.
verse 16. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom neither in the churches of God. For the longest time, I thought that had to do with the custom of the hair. This man says that what he's talking about, if you're contentious about um, observing cultural morals and mores that have moral significance, uh, if you're going to be contentious about that, we don't have a custom within the church that avoids that. In other words, it's not taught within the church that we have liberty as a Christian. We can just divorce ourselves from culture and from our civilization. We can just do anything that's permissible within itself, that's right, without any concern whatsoever as far as the impression we're making on others. And what he's saying, that is not what we follow. The church is always going to be concerned about cultural issues that have moral significance. Uh, I wished I could think of a whole lot uh, of examples. I've used the example before, and this goes back, it's certainly not today, but when I was growing up, uh, it was not appropriate for a Christian to go to a pool hall because of just what was associated with the pool hall where I grew up was down in the basement. Is where people got together, men, and the language was not appropriate. Sometimes drinking was a part of it, and this sort of thing. And so for me to say, well, there's nothing wrong with playing pool. I'm just going to go anyway. Uh, that would have been a violation of this principle that's given here. Um, at one time, playing cards carried the same connotation. A Christian could not play cards. Well, dominoes, even at a time, was horse racing, car racing. Right. All of these things at one time had moral significance, and so a Christian would have to be very careful in a situation like that, not to give the impression that I don't care. I'm a person of loose morals. When I participate in that, I'm going to participate in everything else, the gambling and everything. Chris?
Talks about natural progression. The old verb phuo, Phuo, it means to produce. So how in nature a woman's hair is produced naturally long, like a lion's mane would be on the male naturally produced, heavier than on the female. And and I think I said this before. God played a trick on men in that He made men rough and ugly and shabby, and when and animal world, isn't it the males that are the prettiest, and they have the plumes and the dances to attract and all that? Well, in the God image made creation, it's the woman, and her natural complexion or her natural production is long hair. Right. That seems to be the indication that the word is a verb which means to naturally be produced. Right. So it's not talking about, like you're saying, a moral thing one way or another. It's just how the body naturally functions.
Let me read what this person has. He says, does not your sense of propriety, developed by long years of habit and experience, and because of the custom which makes long hair a symbol of subjection to the man, teach you that it is a shame unto him? So this is his kind of going along with what you're saying. The principle is that God expects there to be a distinction that is not crossed between a man and a woman. Wendell.
I think that God didn't do that. He reversed what's going on. Men who are uh, exceptionally pleasing to look at, call it that. There's a certain amount of narcissism, and I think that's a fault of the male, uh, and maybe some female, but that in itself would be a sin, narcissism, because you put yourself above all others
Okay.
around you.
All right. In this setting, when he's talking about it's sinful for a man to wear a covering on his head, if the covering was a matter of showing subjection to the woman's head, then for him to wear a covering was to deny his headship over the woman. And so he was not honoring his role that God has given him as far as wearing a covering. It was interesting. One of the books that I read for this talked about because Moses put on the veil when after he had seen God and his face was so shiny that people couldn't look on him. They were afraid of him. So he wore a veil. Some of the rabbis took that as a command that they were to wear a veil every time they approached God. And that became a custom. It was a custom during the days that Christ was living. But that was not involved, that was not a sanction or a command for them to wear the veil. Gina.
the women to be busy at home, love their husbands and children, and Proverbs talks about a wife should work hard at keeping her house, and a wise woman builds her own home. And then we've got the one that says, if a man will not work, he shall not eat. Well, it really sounds like only men are supposed to work and women are supposed to stay at home. So if we're going to take all this like this, women aren't supposed to be working, be staying at home. If we,
Yet the Proverbs 31 talks about the ideal woman. What did she do? She had a business. You also have examples of the seller of purple in the New Testament that was a convert. So you have to take all of this and reason it out as far as what's being intended. Yes.
But for me, she couldn't work, she was in trouble.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Of course, the instruction was for the family to take care of her. But if her family refused to do that, then, you know, the church sometimes took that on. Right. Right.
Men are less providing, nurturing, cheaper need than women.
Right.
Women are more able, but that's not true in every case.
No.
So there, there are some generalizations for us to follow that may not be true.
Not everyone's going to be married. Not every woman. Uh, one of the books again that I've read, and this the man was quoting a woman. Uh, she had never married, and he questioned her why. And she said, "I never met a man that I was willing to be submissive to." So it's best that she not marry because that was a command. Once you marry, you are to be submissive to that man. But right.
She is subjected.
Absolutely. Right. Right. And when this whole section is talking about Christ being the head of the man, does not mean that he's not the head of the woman also.
This is in life. When you get as old as, I'll just throw that in there. And it's nothing uncommon to see a husband and wife that he didn't wear the pants. I know one that they're both dead now. If he was talking about a subject or something that just carry on a conversation and he had to kind of make a decision, he looked at his wife first for the answer to give.
Is that right? She was the neck that turned the head, huh? Well, kind of summarizing this all up, the whole section is that God is supreme over Christ, Christ is over man, man is over his wife. That's the order of authority that's been established by God. And there is to be a distinction, whatever the culture is, there is a distinction, the way a man looks and the way a woman looks. And we're not to try to look like the opposite sex. I do believe that's a sin. In the 60s, you remember that was the push. Everything was unisex. You remember that? Where they wanted the men to look like women and women to look like men. That was a real push. Satan was pushing that, but we cannot violate. That's the principle. Yes, sir, Mr. Larry. I think we got to the end of chapter 11.